Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So I'm going to try and I was just speaking to Adam about this actually. Also, one of the challenges of learning Muktza, as I mentioned, is not becoming overwhelmed by the whole of the numerous sugyas that deal with Muktza in Shabbos and in Beitzah and in Sukkah and in all the times that these sugyas come up, and it's just vast and a little overwhelming. So I'm going to try today to in inverted commas finish off the conceptual things that I want to focus on in Mevatel Kli MeHechano, and then for the next year plod through the sort of get back to the Chaburah. But the only way we can build up knowledge of Muktza is by sort of pausing a bit to explore the concepts behind it. So this is what we're going to try and do today. So very briefly, Mevatel Kli MeHechano, we saw a position that it's boiner. That's the issue going on over here. A drabonon that treats it akin to boner because it's fixing something to the ground. A drabonon that treats it akin to soiser because it's just removing the functionality of a Keli. Two versions of Rashi. A possibility that just making something Muktza in and of in itself is a problem on Shabbos, maybe because it's a miyut of simchas of covered Shabbos rather. And then finally, the Sefer Yereim, which I think I touched upon, but I just want to spell out. The Sefer Yereim, written by the Re'im, important Halacha work from the time of the Bali Tosfos. The Sefer Yereim says that the following words, let's just read this inside, it's in source 8. Kaiman on Rabbi Yitzchak, the Omar Beperik Kira, that's our sugya. Kshem she'ein Kli tachas tanagodos a couple beit sasim mishum the aim of Mevatel Kli MeHechano kach in kofen kli b'shvil shelo teshava the ein kli nitzel elo davar nitzel. So Rabbi Yitzchak in the hemshech of the Gemara, in the continuation of the Gemara, goes back to the idea that a kli can't be moved for the tzorech of davar she'eino nitzel, for the tzorech of something Muktza. You can't move kli A for the sake of kli B when kli B is Muktza. Now, the difference on a practical level between the two reasons is that Mevatel Kli MeHechano is only whether the Kli A that you're moving becomes Muktza because of Kli B, and others it becomes a bosses where you put it underneath. Ein Kli Nittel is even kofen, even where you put it on top. That's Rabbi Yitzchak's point. Now, the Yereim links the two reasons together, and he says we paskin like Rabbi Yitzchak in the same way as we paskin that you can't be Mevatel Kli MeHechano. Now, these two realms, these two reasons are radically different from each other. There seems to be no association between the two reasons. Mevatel Kli MeHechano is because of boner or soiser or the like, whereas ein kli nittel is that you're not allowed to move something for the sake of something Muktza. What is the connection between the two? And the answer seemingly to this question is helps us understand another dimension to Mevatel Kli MeHechano and also another dimension to ein kli nittel. And this ties into with what we've discussed previously, that rather than thinking about something being Muktza or not being Muktza, probably the healthier way of thinking about it is that a kli, a utensil, is a bundle of hishtamshios, a bundle of functions, a bundle of uses, and different aspects of the use can be mutter or not. So things can be mutter with respect to some things and not with respect to other things. When we talk about an object being mutter, that's a shorthand way of saying all its functionality is mutter. But sometimes an object is Muktza and we call it Muktza, and we don't mean all its functionality is Muktza. So for example, a klisha melachot issa, we mean its normal functionality is Muktza, but if I find a permissible use for the Keli, it wouldn't be Muktza, it'd be Muktza l'tzorech gufay. So a hammer is Muktza. When I say a hammer is Muktza, I mean scum to move the hammer, because the normal use of a hammer is for hammering nails, and that's a building activity, which is also, if it's a klisha melachot issa, I can't move the guf of the hammer for no reason. But if I want to move the hammer l'tzorech gufay, if I want to use the hammer for a mutter use, with respect to that functionality, it's not Muktza. So we said that's a healthier way of looking at Muktza. Now, in the link of the Yereim between Mevatel Kli MeHechano and ein kli nittel, tzorech davar she'eino nittel, I can't move a Keli for the purpose of a Muktza Keli, is one of the pieces of evidence for this model of Muktza that we are developing, and gives us another reason of understanding Mevatel Kli MeHechano. Because what on earth would be the link between these two completely different reasons of Mevatel Kli MeHechano and ein kli nittel? And the answer is that in the Uraim's view, it would seem that one is simply a more extreme form of the other. Mevatel Kli MeHechano means don't take a utensil and dedicate it to a Muktza function on Shabbos, which means making it Muktza. In other words, specifying its use for Muktza functionality is also on Shabbos, because with respect to that use, it is Muktza. The Muktza means not non-muchen. By definition, it's not muchen for setting it aside for a Muktza use, for turning it into a Muktza object by making it a deposit for something that's Muktza. Ein Kli Nitzal is simply a softer version of that idea, an extension of that idea, or stricter version of that idea. It's an extension of the idea. It says, not only can I not do this where I'm dedicating the Kli to that and where it will be now defined by that new functionality, also known as bossis, where it itself becomes Muktza, but I shouldn't even move it for the sake of a Muktza item, even though it's not dedicated or defined by that role. Nonetheless, I'm using it for a functionality of the Soyos of Muktza that's also Asa. So when I take a Kli and I put it over a Muktza item, it's simply over it, it's protecting it. I can move it at will if I wish, and I can take it away without any problem at all. But I've used it for a Muktza item, says Rabbi Yitzchak, even that's Asa. The opinion that we're learning now in the Gemara says, no, don't go that far. Just moving something where I'm sort of putting it on top of something temporarily, that's not forbidden. However, if I specify its use by making it a bossis, when now it itself becomes Muktza, that is using a Muktza Kli, a non-Muktza Kli, for a Muktza functionality. Or more accurately, when we say something is a non-Muktza Kli, what we mean is that its functionality is not Muktza. However, this functionality of using it for the Torah of something which is Muktza, it is Muktza for. So this is another the final explanation that we're sharing in Mevatel Kli MeHechano, which is it's Muktza din. It's in line with it becoming making something Muktza. All kelim are Muktza for with respect to making them Muktza. That functionality, by definition, they're not prepared for.
You're saying Mevatel Kli is a subset then. The Rosh Ein HaMital, every Mevatel Kli is the Rosh Ein HaMital.
That's what the Uraim is saying, yes. That's correct, yes. Every Mevatel Kli MeHechano is very nicely put, yes. It's a subset or a more extreme version of that's exactly right, yeah. Yeah, exactly right. Now, I have to say, in terms of language of the Gemara, there is a beauty in these readings. According to
that's exactly right. Could you repeat that, please?
Oh, sorry, yes. Adam just basically summarized that. I should have summarized it like this. He's 100% correct. That what we're saying is that Mevatel Kli MeHechano is a subset of Ein Kli Nittel. Ein Kli Nittel is a more generic Issa. The opinion that says there's only Mevatel Kli MeHechano, what that means to say is it's a subset of Ein Kli Nittel, not just where you're using a Keli for something that's Muktza, but where you define a Keli by its use for something which Muktza, then that's Asa. So yeah, that's a clear summary. Okay, so this is I'm just getting a little bit of interference here, so I'm just going to mute everyone, but obviously unmute yourselves if you want to ask anything. So, okay, so this is the fourth explanation of Mevatel Kli MeHechano. Rashi, just as a point of language of Gemara, Rashi, who learns that their prohibition is boina or sosa, it means that the Gemara, Mevatel Kli MeHechano means making something Muktza, but the reason there's a problem in making something Muktza is because of a next stage problem. Through that, it's boina or sosa. Whereas if you learn like the Ritva, who says that fundamentally there's a new issa for making something Muktza because of bittul covered Shabbos, or you learn like the Uraim, who says that with respect to this, it is Muktza, it's a little bit nicer in the language of the Gemara. It means that the core problem over here is the Mevatel Kli MeHechano, is making it Muktza. That's the intrinsic, in and of in itself, there's a new aspect of Muktza, or new prohibition of making things Muktza. Whereas according to Rashi, it's a new drabonon which isn't really spelled out of a gezerah of don't do. Really, this is a gezerah atu boina or gezerah atu sosa. That's what we really should call it. The bittul kli MeHechano is a gezerah atu boina or gezerah atu sosa. How do I do that? By making it Muktza. But it's a little neater. The Uraim's reading, because the Gemara says everything it needed to say. It didn't miss out any information. Rashi, it missed out information that this is a problem because of Bono, because of Sosa. As it to the Uraim, it said everything it needed to say. Mevatel Kli MeHechano is in and of in itself the prohibition. Okay, so this is the different views in the Rishonim as to the Issa. I just wanted to spend a bit of time explaining the nafkaminas between these different opinions, because very, very interestingly, this translates into halacha lemaisa questions around the parameters of this issa. I deliberately didn't print source sheets in which I sort of list all the Shulchan Aruchs and Magen Avrahams and Mishnah Berurahs around this, because it's at least I'm feeling overwhelmed enough, and I suspect everyone else is. We're really entering into a whole new massive sugya of Muktza, as I said, and just it's too much to go into all of this. But what I tried to draw out are some of the nafkaminas that we've anyway sort of touched upon. And there's a wealth of nafkaminas between these reasons, but I just want to talk about a few of those that we sort of touched upon without going into detail. So we saw in Tosfos on the last Amud, Tosfos on Mem Beis Amud Beis, was medayik in the Gemara, in the Mishnah, that ve'ein niyusam mimenu means to say that if you put something as a plate to accept oil drops before Shabbos, it would only be Muktza with respect to benefit, but not with respect to tiltul. This was, by the way, another one of our sources that Muktza, when we're being lazy when we say something is Muktza or not Muktza, what we more accurately need to say is Muktza with respect to which functions, because Tosfos at least was of the opinion that Einius and Mimenu we need to be medayik that language, and that means you can't benefit from it. Do you remember the mashal we saw? This is Tosfos de Ramasal of Einius and Mimenu, and the mashal that we saw on that, I think we looked at the mashal that says that the pshat is that it only becomes osir in tiltul, not in anything else. And based on that, Tosfos said that this is going like Rabbi Shimon and not like Rabbi Yehuda and everything else that we discussed. There, we're not going to go into that. We will revisit it from now onwards in another Tosfos. Now, if this is the correct reading, or let's step back from that, we can ask a question: is Mevatel Keli MeHechano only when you make something Muktza with respect to movement, or even when you make something Muktza with respect to benefit? And this is a very beautiful question, because it brings out the nafkaminas between the different reasons. If the reason behind Mevatel Keli MeHechano is boina, that you've fixed something in its plate, as if you've cemented it in its place, as per Rashi, then l'chora that would only make sense if it is a muktza of movement, correct? If you merely make something lose its functionality, I can't benefit from it, I can't use it, but I can still move it, why would that be a gezerah of boina? Whereas if the reason is like Rashi's other reason of sosa, that I've removed the functionality of the Keli, I've destroyed the Keli as a drabanon, then you can hear that even removal of benefit or use would be, that level of Muktza would be enough to make it included in the Gezerah. Now, what this brings, I think that's reasonable reasoning. What this brings out is that the steer we had between the two reasons of Rashi is a really heavy one. We sort of blurred it over a little bit with the answer to Pnei Yeshua that both reasons are true, and it depends which one and which one. But if we're correct, there's a massive nafkamina between the two reasons. They're two types of Mevatel Keli MeHechano. It definitely makes it more problematic to say that hidden in the Gemara are two different Mevatel Keli MeHechano based on two different gezerahs with different halachic ramifications. Again, just to remind ourselves, Rashi by us says that the reason is boina because you're fixing it in place. Rashi elsewhere says sosa. One answer that we looked at, they're all busy themselves with answers to Rashi. Tosfos really asks this to you, by the way, it's not our question. Tosfos asked the question. Pnei Yeshua answered that it depends with korum and kasosos, where it's not the norm to build. The gezerah is sosa with plates where you can't say that you're removing functionality because you're using it to catch the drops. The gezerah is boina. Very nice answer to the two explanations. It means that Mevatel Keli MeHechano, which is one phrase in the Gemara, is built in two gezerahs, two different reasons. But we can live with that. Chazal had two reasons for making gezerah, and therefore they made a catch-all in different cases. But according to this, there's nafkaminas between the two reasons. So unless you say again, Chazal smoothed over the nafkaminas, made it always also just to, it just adds a level of difficulty to this problem we have with Rashi, that for some reason he gives different reasons without explanation. But either way, just to the point of logic, if the reason is because of sosa, it would matter if you're removing functionality. If the reason is boina, it would only matter if you can't move it, if there is a muktzah that's been created as tiltul. The final two reasons, that in and of in itself making something muktzah is problematic, either because it was muktzah with respect to that use like the ureim, or because it diminishes covered Shabbos like the ritzvah, seemingly there any level of muktzah this would apply to. If I'm using something for a muktzah functionality, whether it's because I can't move it or I can't benefit from it, I'm reducing the usability of the utensil. I'm making it somewhat Muktza, and therefore those reasons would apply. So this is one nafkamina between the different reasons in the Rishonim. Sorry, I think you wanted to ask something or not? No. Okay, so that's one nafkamina between the reasons in the Rishonim. Yeah. Yes.
Are you comparing? And I was assuming tilted was more generic, and Achila is again more specific.
Correct. Yes.
But are you equating the Achila to the mitzvah type benefit? You just gave a thing. You said you could do mitzvah for benefits, and not for tilted. Is benefits equivalent to Achila?
Somewhat equivalent. Benefit means all hana. Achila means achila. When we learn Tosis, we'll revisit this issue. But for now, I'm just saying. Tiltul is everything, and benefit or achila is a more limited muktzah. Would it even apply to the more limited muktzah? But in terms of our nafkamina, if you can move something, clearly that's not sosa. That seems inarguable mathematically. If how can you say it's a gezerah because of sosa? Bone, I'm sorry. How can you say it's a gezerah because of bone or fixing something in its place if it's not fixed in its place? There's no. That seems an inescapable piece of logic. And I have to tell you again, I'm not going to go into the practical expression of this. But this really translates down to practical halacha. There's Rabbi Kivegers and Chazon Ishis and Mogen Avrams and Marshals about these points. In practical day-to-day Shabbos observance, I'm not sure this really ever comes out of the Masechet, so it's such a thing. But in theory, there would be cases where the Mevatel MeHechano applies to which type of Muktza would be relevant, and it comes down to sort of Mishnah Berurah level psak halacha. This is one nafkamina. A second interesting nafkamina, which is not my own idea, I wish I knew enough Torah to have come up with this myself. I saw it brought in one of the Likut Sorim, is whether Mevatel MeHechano would apply to a Keli which is earthed, which is attached to the ground already. I don't know, you have a big or a massive Keli which is unmovable. You have a fridge or an oven, or something that's mechuber l'karka. You literally attach a keli to the ground, a basin, a wash basin, or something of the sort. I'm not going to into the halachas whether sometimes when you attach things to the ground, those who love Taurus will know. Sometimes when you attach things to the ground, they lose their keli status. Sometimes not. But there are cases where you attach something to the ground, it remains a keli. It's simply an attached keli. Now, would the prohibition of Mevatel MeHechano apply in that case? So again, it's a nafkamina between the reasons. If Mevatel MeHechano, the problem Mevatel MeHechano is because of boner, because I'm attaching it to the ground, because I'm making it immovable because of the prohibition of Muktza, because of the issa of Muktza, then if it's already attached to the ground, you couldn't say Mevatel MeHechano because of that. Whereas if the issa of Mevatel MeHechano is by making something Muktza or sosa, then again, I had a usable fridge or a usable basin, and I've made it unusable by making it Muktza, then the issa would apply. And again, not my own ideas over here, but this again translates down to Mogen Avraham level to real practical halacha. A kli which is anyway mechuber l'karka, anyway unmovable. Am I doing anything extra? Am I making a muktzah? If the whole problem is boina that I'm fixing it in place, no. If the problem is sosa or making things muktzah, then yes. Another nafkamina is, and again, I'm saying this simply that we understand the difference between the reasons. Another nafkamina is whether Mevatel MeHechano applies to non-kalim. But what are scenarios of non-kalim? For example, food. If I make food into a bossis, or I use food to cover something, or covering something would be enkli nittel, but making something in the bossis, would the reasons apply? Now, if the problem is, here you have a slightly different lineup of views. If the problem is sosa, destroying something, there's no prohibition of destroying food on Shabbos. In fact, we all do it every time we eat. Whereas if you chuck out leftover food on Shabbos or the like, right, there's no sort of destroying food on Shabbos. Boina and sosa, well, sosa at least is a halacha category that applies to a keli. You're taking utensil and you're defunctioning it. That's sosa of the keli. With food, if I make the food muktzah by making a bossis, or other non-kalim, l'chora Mevatel MeHechano wouldn't apply to sosa. The other example of non-kalim is, again, I don't want to go into all the details because we get very caught up in massive hilchos muktzah, but situations where, for example, you want to prop things up with beams and the like. There can be situations where beams are not kalim but are nonetheless not muktzah, and again, there'll be questions around Mevatel MeHechano where you make we use a non-Keli item like a beam or food item. So again, let's just go through the reasons. If the reason is boina, building, in other words, by attaching something to the ground that looks like building, maybe Mevatel ki MeHechano would apply, maybe not. The Bnei Yeshua would argue not, because the Bnei Yeshua said since the way isn't, the derech isn't to build with korim mixosas, with pillows, there's no gezerah makes sense there. To cover home with food. There's no binyan with food. I mean, who's ever heard of binyan food? How would you have the gezerah? It's more than just, it's not the derech to do, it's there is no melachot of binyan with food, gluing food to the ground. So the chorah, the gezerah wouldn't make sense of boina. Sosa, the gezerah definitely wouldn't make sense because there's no prohibition of stiras oichlim on Shabbos. Beams, which aren't kalim, boina maybe would apply, but sosa wouldn't apply because they're anyway not kalim, so there's no melachot of sosa with the beam. If you detach a beam from the ground, that's sosa. If you defunctionalize a beam, that's not sosa because it never was a keli. And making things Muktza, the reason would apply. So in this shaila, we have distinctions between the non-kalim that we're talking about, whether it's foods or beams, and the alignments of the different viewpoints of again is different to the nafkaminas in the previous scenarios. So again, this is just bringing out, and again, this translates down to practical halacha. Yeah. If you redefine food permanently as a non-food purpose, then it ceases to be food. In the Yom Dioma, where do we see this halachic concept? Over the season that we've just passed through. We see this with Pesach. So if you make chometz item into a utensil, so a modern, the Gemara's example is where you make a chair or something out, a stool out of hardened dough. Very practical example. There's a lot of people have ornaments which include glazed, I don't know, pasta made into a picture on the wall or something like that. So these are practical examples. There you're correct. You've made the functionality of foods into a non-food function. Here, however, we mustn't get confused between Hilchos Shabbos and regular Hilchos Kelim. And you and I gave a sort of comparison to Taurus a few moments ago. Shabbos and other halachas behave differently. Don't forget, I'm using this food item as a bossis, let's say bossis to put under Muktza, but I'm only doing it temporarily. It's fixed in the sense that with respect to Hilchos Muktza, this now becomes its functionality over Shabbos. But after Shabbos, I'm going to take the food away and perhaps eat it or something of the sort. So it wouldn't be enough to redefine it. With respect to Hilchos Pesach, because it's a bossis on Shabbos, doesn't mean it wouldn't be chometz with respect to Pesach. By the way, all of this is very nogea in Hilchos Pesach also, all this discussion, because one of the questions is if you find chometz on Pesach, on Yom Tov, what do you do with it? Shabbos, Yom Tov, Shabbos, where you can't burn it. You can burn things on Yom Tov, but you can't burn chometz on Yom Tov because the chometz is Muktza, and also because you're burning it shalom l'torach. So what do you do? And the answer is kofin on of Keli. You put a utensil over it to protect it, and you get into the halachic discussion and inkly nittel. So this is in Yom Tov topics. So either way, it's still machal, it's still a food, even though your reasoning is correct that if it ceases to be food, if you define it for a new role, but here we're only talking about definition for Shabbos. Yeah, that's another example. We use it as glue. Thank you. Yeah.
Is that what you consider food?
It's the same discussion over there in the posting where you use flour and water as wallpaper paste as a glue, which they used to use it as a glue. Is it always into mutter? And their distinction is whether it's reversible or not, and other things. Yeah. This is linked to the discussions around, not quite the same, but somewhat linked to the discussions around perfumes and the like, and deodorants and alcoholic-based substances. That's all them. Yeah, sorry.
Just on this part of Mevatel ki MeHechano, if you are taking the plate and putting it under the chicken or under the candle, before the oil has dripped or before the egg has been laid, is it Muktza at that point? Because it's not really yet the process of us.
Correct.
What point does it actually become Muktza? Because it was a question.
No, it's a good question. So with respect to inkly nittel, that's clearly straight away because I'm doing it for those there. With respect to bosses, only when the drop fell. Only at that point does it become a bosses, because only at that point is there something on it. Nonetheless, I'm making a bosses by placing it there.
But you could remove it before the drop fell or before the egg has been.
Correct, but causing it, correct, but causing it would be enough to make it Muktza. That's inherent in this gzeira of Mevatel ki MeHechano. Mevatel ki MeHechano is always a a sort of indirect causation thing, because I can't directly make it Muktza. I make it Muktza by, or in many cases, I'm not directly making it Muktza. I'm making it Muktza by it receiving something. Yeah, we'll get back to your shayla in a little more detail. It ties in a little bit to the discussion around when I'm doing it on Erev Shabbos, and our discussion around how can there be halachas about Erev Shabbos, why would things not be allowed on Erev Shabbos? It's a little bit associated with that, but we'll go back to that. You are onto though a little point which, with respect to the next nafkamina that I want to mention, which again I'm mentioning this nafkamina simply because we've touched upon it already. Rashi, in that I printed in source 2, says that it's Rashi says the reason why this spark catching plate becomes osa is because it becomes a bossis. Rashi by us on our sugya spelt out that became Muktza, which led to our confusion. That is this a separate reason or not? Now, evidently, Rashi is of the opinion that to explain Mevatel Keli MeHechano, you have to say that it's become Muktza. More specifically, which sorts of Muktza? Bosses. Why? Because if Rashi evidently holds that if it is Boina or Sosa, it's only considered Boina or Sosa if the change I make in it is that it's actually become Muktza. Is that Svara Muchach or not? Now, if the nature of the prohibition of Mevatel Keli MeHechano is like the ureim, let's say, that I have made it, that I'm using it for a Muktza use, then yes, the only example of Mevatel Keli MeHechano would be if I make it Muktza, if it actually becomes Muktza. If it's like the Ritva, that it's putting things out of action over Shabbos, miyot to cover Shabbos, you could wonder what about other forms of putting things out of action on Shabbos? Would that be included in the prohibition or not, even if it doesn't become a bossis, or even if it doesn't become Muktza? If it's Boina or Sosa, you could also wonder that, interestingly. Right? If it's Boina or Sosa, you could wonder why is it that it has to become Muktza or a bossis? Maybe even if it doesn't become Muktza or doesn't become a bossis, if somehow or other it gets fixed in its place, that should be enough to make it Boina or Sosa. But Rashi says not like that. Rashi at least is of the opinion there's only where it becomes Muktza, only where it becomes bossis. And again, I mentioned the previous year when we were learning the Prima Godim's reading of Rashi and analysing what Rashi meant when he said it's Boina or Sosa. You could fix things in their places in other ways on Shabbos. Things could be locked in place for other halachic mechanisms. I think I mentioned, again, not my own example, but one that the Chonim brought. If you put something on top of a tree where the tree bends as the weight of it, so removing it would be a problem because you'll be causing the tree to move or causing Muktza to move without something becoming a bossis. There are scenarios where you can't move something even though it's not a bossis because it becomes because moving it would move Muktza or the like. So would that be enough? Would an incidental, external, extraneous factor that stops something being movable be enough to make it prohibited to move on Shabbos? Again, would be enough minute. I'll just mention one other thing and then I'll finish because again this ties into a big topic. Those of you who have begun looking at Tosas and Tosas' reference to Gemara and Bates and so on would have seen a discussion about beginning to dip our toes into a discussion that we're not going to go into, which is around Muktza that isn't Muktza for the whole of Shabbos, and this concept that once something is Muktza bein Hashmashos, it stays Muktza for the whole of Shabbos. Once something becomes a bossis, it remains Muktza for the whole of Shabbos. It's a very, very big and complex machlokus Rishonim and really Gemara and Rishonim as to how to apply these halachas. But again, we can wonder about if something would be a temporary Muktza. Would this be a problem of Mevatel Keli MeHechano or not? And again, nafkamin is between the different reasons. So let me just give a couple of examples of that. One of the Gemaras talks about where birds land. I cause birds to land on a Keli, and the Keli becomes a bossis for the efrochim that lands on it. And then they fly off, and maybe it ceases to be a bossis, or something which ceases to be Muktza by a process of time over Shabbos could also be enough. Situations where you have Muktza just for some of Shabbos, and making something Muktza for part of Shabbos, would this be and again, I just want to remind ourselves, we've seen two examples of this in the Gemara already. One example was Tevel, where the Gemara says you can make it stop being Tevel and it will cease to be Muktza. And that's one nafkamina. And the other example is Tosfos, who argued that in Rabbi Shimon, that once the candle, remember, it was spooky action from by distance. The candle goes out in this side of the room, and my Keli, which has oil drops caught in it, in this side of the room, ceases to be Muktza, according to Rabbi Shimon. We struggle to understand the numbers of that. But whether we understand it or not, that's Tosfos' view. Remember again, Tosfos on Mem Beis on Matanov, Mem Beis on Beis. that Tosfos are the view that according to Rabbi Shimon, when the candle goes out, it might cease to be Muktza. So I just put that out there as another nafkamina, which is something which is temporarily Muktza. Would that be included in the takana of Mevatel MeHechano? Again, a machlokus, a practical machlokus, and maybe distinguish between the reasons. With this, I'm going to conclude the conceptual part of what we're talking about Mevatel MeHechano, because we need to get back to nuts and bolts and begin sort of learning Gemara and Tosfos again. So next year we'll go back to the plodding hard work of actually reading Tosfos and working out what they're saying on the sugya. But I hope that's just sort of broadened the discussion about Mevatel MeHechano, because it's a very important halachic topic.
Can I just ask a question about
Yeah.
the seventh case?
Yes.
When we say that it's not does that mean it's, I think you mentioned it before. Maybe I'm standing wrong. I thought because it's Mechan, Tero is never called Muktza. It's also.
We'll see that when we get to the Gemara. But all I was saying was, you're right for putting up on that. All I was saying is, we've seen examples of temporary things, and we'll have to work out in the Gemara how that fits with this. Also, Tosfos that we've learned already doesn't spell out how Rabbi Shimon's view ties into Mevatel MeHechano, but we'll have to do that work. And Tosfos on our Amud also forces us back into that a little bit. Yeah. So you're right. I was just using it as an example of that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Have a good day. Online also. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.